Welcome back to another interview. I'm Joanna, and today I am joined with activist and podcaster Katie Breen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joanna.
Of course, anytime. So you are the voice behind the Femtastic podcast. When did that start, and how did you find your interest and passion in podcasting?
Yeah, so I started the podcast in spring of 2016, so 5 years ago. And at the time I was working in marketing and I liked my job, but I knew that ultimately in the long term, I didn't really want to be in marketing anymore. I didn't really feel passionate about what I was doing. And I had all of these other interests outside of work related to feminism and social justice. And I felt like I needed an outlet to start exploring those passions outside of my job. And so I started the podcast as sort of like a extracurricular hobby outside of my job, both to sort of like indulge those passions so that I did have an outlet for them. And then also because I knew that I needed a career change, and I knew that I was interested in this like broad bucket of topics. And the podcast helped me to figure out like what I might want to do next, because I got to learn more from all these experts in different topics about what they did and what they were working on. And that is really what helped me change careers, because now I work in public health, and that's definitely partially because of the podcast sort of opening my eyes to like, oh, like if I want to work in something related to like reproductive rights or reproductive justice, it doesn't have to be like as a lawyer. And that is sort of what the podcast showed me.
Mm-hmm. So what was it like interviewing all these different people, talking about all these different issues?
It's really interesting. I mean, I think it's really fun, and the actual interviews, like being in an interview with the people, it's my favorite thing about the podcast. Like for me, I've always sort of been like, honestly, like if no one listens to the podcast, that's fine, like whatever. I will still have fun in these conversations. So it's been really cool. Everyone, I think it like one of the things it's taught me is that like pretty much everyone is much more approachable than you think they're going to be or you think they might be. So like don't be intimidated to ask people to be like involved in your work, because usually people are interested to talk more about their work, and they're not usually as like pretentious, or not even pretentious, but like, I sometimes felt like, oh, I feel like unworthy to ask this person because I'm like small potatoes to them.
Yeah.
But I found that actually isn't a super common feeling. And honestly, like the people who would feel that way, like, they're like, sure, that's probably justified in some cases. And maybe they're not the people I want to talk to anyway, if they're going to be like pretentious, because I definitely feel like allergic to pretense. Like I hate when people are pretentious or snobby. So it's fine if those people wouldn't want to be on the podcast anyway, but I found that really the opposite. Most people are very approachable.
Mm-hmm. I found that too, like doing this kind of stuff too. I found that too.
Yeah.
So listening to your early episodes of your podcast and then comparing them to your latest, I've noticed like an ad and a theme song and just like the confidence in your voice. So can you talk a little bit about your journey and just your growth in your podcast?
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely like I added a theme song, but I should say like it's definitely still a very low production podcast. So like there's a theme song, but I pretty much do the same formula every time, where there's a theme song and then I do an introduction, I roll the episode, and then I do like an outro. And that hasn't really changed, which I'm fine with, because like there are so many fantastic podcasts with really high production value. And like, do I wish I had high production value? Yes. But I have a full-time job and I don't make money from the podcast. So every like investment I've made in the podcast, like for new branding, I got new branding like in August and a new website. Every investment I've made has been like totally out of my own money.
Mm-hmm.
So it hasn't evolved much in terms of production. But one thing I did learn too is in the beginning, I thought, oh, I'll do an interview and then I'll edit every interview and like clean up, you know, the ums and the pauses and stuff. I quickly learned, and you've probably learned this with YouTube, it takes so much time to edit something. It's like not even worth the final product you get. Like the final product you get isn't like better enough to justify the amount of time spent editing. So the first few episodes, the first episode, I probably spent 40 hours editing it because it was my first time and I'd never edited anything before. And I was trying really hard and learning the software. Now, if I wanted to edit more, I could do it more quickly, but it still takes forever. So I don't edit. Basically, I tell people like, there'll be an intro, there'll be an outro. I'm pretty much not going to edit anything you say unless, of course, you know, you say something and then you're like, oh, actually, I didn't mean to say that, or I shouldn't have said that, or I cursed and I didn't want to curse. I can like note down the time and like deal with like little things, but I'm not editing the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that's been a shift in my mind. I learned pretty quickly, like, oh, I can't do that. Your other question about confidence, I'm glad you've noticed that. Because I appreciate that feedback because I haven't noticed it like in myself. But now that you say that, I like believe that it's probably true. Because I definitely felt like in the beginning when I would listen to the episodes, I was like, oh my God, do I say that much? Or like I noticed in my editing that I sounded really hesitant when I was asking the questions. Like I would talk really slowly because I was like really deliberating in my mind about like the right words and like not sounding stupid or like asking a stupid question. And I do think I'm better at that now, although I haven't really noticed it for myself. I also don't listen to the episodes other than like if I edit them. So that's something too. But I also wonder, you know, I wonder if part of that confidence has come from like just being more comfortable in the fields that I end up interviewing people about. Like if they're talking about a topic within a certain field, I probably know more about that now than I did 5 years ago.
Right.
And I also wonder too, like, if I am, I definitely like a year ago had like a come to Jesus moment where I was like, so I had been in grad school from like 2018-ish to 2020, like January 2020. And during grad school, I didn't have as much time, obviously, to like go out and find people. And so I started, both now and then, a lot of the people I get on the show come to me, like a PR company will reach out to me, or like a media company that represents like an author will reach out to me. And in the past, I feel like I said yes to too many things that weren't actually like really aligned with the podcast or weren't really something I was interested in. And that does not make for a good interview. So I think that part of it has changed too. Was like a year ago, I was like, I don't have to say yes to everything. I think I had a really like scarcity mindset that like, oh, if I don't say yes, like no one else will come. But that's not true. So I've been much more intentional in the last year about like really thinking about the offers I get and really considering if it makes sense for me or if I'm actually interested in it. And I think that has probably made me more confident too, because when I'm doing a topic that's like, I feel like I'm like, it's really a stretch to like really make people see how it's relevant to like how it fits into Femtastic and like why it's relevant to this podcast. I don't know. I think like if I wasn't as passionate about the topic, that probably shone through and I probably wasn't as confident. Right. So Yeah.
That's so funny that you mentioned saying yes. That's like one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give people, to always say yes to opportunities. So that's so funny. So I mean, I'll probably come full circle like you and realize
Yeah.
like what I'm interested in. But
Well, and I think it's like you get to a point where you don't have to say yes to everything. And I do think, like when I was in grad school, had I not been saying yes to those things, I probably wouldn't have had episodes.
mhm.
So, and I'm not saying that every episode I did while in grad school I didn't like. That's not true. Some of my favorite ones happened while I was in grad school, but there were a couple that I think felt like more of a stretch for me
Mhm.
to make them relevant. And sometimes that stretch, like you won't even see it on the surface, because I did a lot of work in crafting the questions and like the topic of the interview to make it more relevant. Whereas the proposal came out over here. And then I was like, well, what's going on over here? And that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think to your point, like say yes to opportunities to a point, but like not at the expense of like your joy. Like say yes if it's going to be fun.
Yeah, of
But
course.
don't like if you and like it's okay if you say yes a couple times and it doesn't end up well, but if you like start saying yes all the time, like and it takes you too far from like actually where you want to be, or like that's when it gets to be a problem. And that's what I realized like a year ago. I was like, I was feeling really kind of meh on the podcast a little bit. Like I wasn't feeling like proud of some of the things. And I was like, it's because I've let myself say yes to too many things that are too far from like the heart of what I want this podcast to be.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think you learn that as you go. And in the beginning, I said yes to lots of things, and I don't regret saying yes to any of it, but it definitely like opened my eyes that like if I say no to something, it's not going to be the last offer that I get.
Yeah. So you were talking about topics that you feel confident about. What was your experience like on TEDx talking about those topics that you're confident about?
Well, it's interesting because my TEDx talk was about privilege and, you know, how everyone has some degree of privilege, and we need to like really use our privilege. And I was speaking about it generally, but like some of the specifics were definitely about like racial privilege, like white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I didn't feel qualified to talk about those topics. Like I felt sort of like an imposter. Like, who am I to be talking about this? I don't really like it's, and I said this in my talk, but like I don't consider, like I guess I'm an activist, but like I don't consider myself to be an activist, only because I feel like we have in our minds this image of an activist, of like someone who like that's what they do for their full-time job, and they like are marching through the streets and like with protest signs and stuff. And like I do that sometimes, but I'm not like a community organizer, which is like who the true, to me, like when I think of an activist, I think of like a community organizer who that's their job, they live and breathe it, whatever. I am podcasting from the comfort of my home. Like, so anyway, I felt really, when I was invited to do the TEDx talk, I didn't know what I was going to talk about. I said yes, which I was a good thing to say yes to, but I didn't know what I was going to talk about. And I was like, you invited me to do this and you don't even know what I'm going to talk about. You just have confidence that it'll be okay. Okay. So I don't even remember how I got to the topic of my talk, but I really didn't feel confident at the time to be this like white woman who worked in marketing and had a podcast to be talking about like how to be an ally, or like, you know, talking about privilege. I think I've learned since then that like we all have to start somewhere, and we also all have something to contribute to the conversation. And like, while I still feel imposter syndrome about the whole thing, about the whole TEDx thing and everything I said, I do still like fully believe in what I said. And I think, I don't know, like, you know, you put on confidence for a talk like that. And I felt confident in the message that I was giving. I didn't totally feel confident that I was the right person to give it. But in retrospect, it's like the whole point of the talk is that like we all have privilege and we all have a role to play in like lending our privilege to people with less privilege and to like speaking up about social justice. And you're like, most people are going to feel like imposters, and it's better to speak up than to not say anything. So while I still have imposter syndrome about that and about like a lot of things in life, which I think most people do too, I'm still glad I said yes to the opportunity. And like, I can rationalize in my mind why I should feel confident. I don't always feel confident though.
Yeah, of course not. We're all human, but
Yeah.
but I thought that was a really interesting TED Talk, and thanks for sharing your experiences. So,
Yeah.
who are some of your biggest inspirations for that kind of stuff?
It's a good question. Well, I think in general, like, and I don't know if there's any one person, but like, I feel inspired by people who work in the reproductive rights movement and reproductive justice, because unfortunately in this world and climate, it's a brave choice to be talking about abortion and be talking about abortion access and birth control and all of that stuff. And I really admire the confidence and the steadfastness and the, I don't know, like the clarity of message of a lot of the people who work in that movement and who are just like not going to be intimidated by literal death threats and like all the crazy stuff that happens. So I really admire those people. I like am very passionate about reproductive rights, and my day job is on looking like at reproductive justice through a different lens, which is about maternal mortality, which is still very much related to reproductive justice, but is much less controversial. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I had a lot of guilt or like grappling with like, you know, I'm passionate about both of those things, but like, I was like, should I like, am I shying away from the movement? Because of, you know, whatever. And I realized like, no, I think for me, if I were to work day to day in reproductive rights, I think I would get burnt out really quickly and like just feel depressed really quickly, because it's like a constant uphill battle. There are constantly states passing crazy ass laws and people who will never agree with you, and people who will think you're a terrible person for having your beliefs or like literally threaten you. And like, I don't feel capable of doing that on a day-to-day basis. I think what my contribution to that movement can be is like preserving my energy in a way that I can contribute in the long term, on the side, and contribute through my day job, which like really is just like part of that whole spectrum, but is much less contentious, and there's much less like personal attacks in it, and it's less defeating on a day-to-day basis. So I feel inspired by them. I also feel super inspired by like lawyers in the reproductive justice and rights and just social justice in general space. Very cliche of me, but I like love Ruth Bader Ginsburg and I've read like everything about her. I also love Sonia Sotomayor, who's another Supreme Court justice who also has like a really amazing story. So like I highly considered becoming a lawyer because I'm like low-key obsessed with lawyers or with law and like constitutional law and all of these things. But so I feel inspired by like people who have gained us all of these rights like through the law and through, you know, groundbreaking Supreme Court cases like RBG, both before she was on the court and when she was on the court.
So did your education include or involve studying about what you're doing now?
No. So my like undergrad education was in marketing. I was a marketing major. Mm-hmm. And I thought I wanted to work in advertising agencies. So that is what I did. Like when I was an intern, like interning in college, and then I did marketing until I went to grad school when I was 28. I went to grad school when I was 28, almost 29. Mm-hmm. So up until then, like from when I was 18 to 28, I was like working in marketing, did internships in marketing. None of it prepared me for like podcasting. Right. It definitely prepared me to work in marketing, but but then on like the topics that I'm interested in, yes and no. Like I took some classes in college that I think were really interesting, and I probably should have paid more attention to like what really lit me up. Like I think I'm such a type A person. I've like been a perfectionist my whole life. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, like I was in college and I was like, I'm a marketing major. This is what I'm going to do. This is like something I can make money in and blah. But I actually like didn't pay attention to the fact that like most of my marketing classes I found to be very boring. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like always boring to me. It just became boring. But like the classes that I felt like really passionate and interested in had nothing to do with marketing. Like I really liked like a human development class that I took randomly to fulfill some credit. I really liked a geriatrics class that I took. I took really interesting classes in sort of like the humanities about like homophobia and the sociology of the American South, which was really interesting. And like a class on like nonviolence. So like those things I think did all relate to what I ended up like doing and being interested in, but I like couldn't see it at the time because I was on such a like I have to do this path and mm-hmm. It has to be this sort of like traditional, not even traditional, but I was like, I want to get out of college and I want to get a job and I want to like not be making minimum wage. So I think I wasn't open to the possibilities that are around me, or like I didn't know how to conceptualize like what it might mean to explore those interests, because like the world isn't set up to like teach you how you can apply your sociology class. So I guess yes and no. Like I was interested in things that like now looking back, it makes sense that I was interested in given that what I do now, but I didn't really learn how to do any of this in college. I probably would have had I picked a different major, not about podcasting, obviously, because they weren't teaching that. I graduated in 2012. They weren't exactly teaching podcasting. Now I'm sure they are, but yeah.
So along with like being on that like path A road, were there any other challenges you had to overcome?
Yeah. I mean, where do I start? I'll just go into a couple, I guess. So for me, so I went to college, like my freshman year was like the fall of 2008, which is like right when the financial recession was happening. And I like learned pretty quickly like I was gonna have to like pay for college. And that was like incredibly stressful to me, because it's like you learn about loans, but like to someone who's, 18, 19, has never made more than like $2,000 a year at their summer job or whatever, the idea of taking out like a giant loan and then having to pay it back is just like mind boggling.
Yeah.
And it's still, I mean, and that doesn't even go into like all of the actual issues with like student debt and blah, blah, blah. But it was just like so terrifying to me. And so I worked really hard to like minimize the amount of debt I had. And that like came with a lot of sacrifices, I guess. So like I became an RA, like a resident assistant, my sophomore year, which I didn't want to do. Like I didn't want to be an RA. I just needed the money because it was going to save me literally like $12,000 a year to be an RA. But it's a really demanding job. Like there's a lot of hours involved. Obviously, you have to come to the semester early and leave late. You have to work a bunch. You have to work really late nights and whatever. And I really wanted to just like be a college student and like have fun with my friends and go out and like be able to like, I joined a sorority. I wanted to like live in the sorority house with my friends. And I felt really like isolated because I was like, I had to live with like underclassmen and have this job. And on top of that, I was like very perfectionistic about school. So I was pretty much working like nonstop. Like I just didn't really have a lot of fun. And at the end of college, I felt like really depressed because, and I say I felt depressed. I mean, I literally was depressed. Like not just like I felt sad. Like I was depressed. I had depression. I had anxiety. And part of like what felt really acute to me then is like I felt like I had worked so hard. And on the outside, I looked very successful, like graduating college. I had a great job to go to. I like spoke to my graduating class at graduation, had like a 4.0. I looked very successful, but I felt miserable. Like I felt like I had missed out on what college is supposed to be. Like you're supposed to make all these lifelong friends, and I did, but like I felt like everyone else had closer relationships than I did because I was always busy. And so like the night of my graduation, which like everyone thought I looked very successful, I gave this like speech in front of thousands of people. I had like a major anxiety attack. Like my boyfriend was like, should I call an ambulance? Because like I was not okay. And I think like, I don't know. I mean, looking back, what could I have done differently? I don't know. Like, I'm glad that I don't have tons and tons of student debt because I made those choices. But I also wish that I had been less perfectionistic. Like it got me good things. It got me a good job. It got me all these good things. But like, I wasn't happy. And like, I wonder who, I don't think I could have been this person, but I wonder who I would have been had I let myself like be a little more imperfect, like not worry so much about grades and just like make those relationships and nourish those relationships and not worry so much about money. And like, I had this RA job, but I had other jobs at the same time too, like a bunch of jobs. Like who would I have been had I not been worrying about that? And had I just let myself be a more normal college student? I don't know, but definitely like, I don't know. I think it's a good reminder that like people who look successful on the outside don't always feel successful or like don't feel happy. Like I was effing miserable. It was like the worst time in my life, probably like my senior year of college when like to most people I probably looked really successful. I was like, it was like one of the lowest points of my life. So, and it's not just because, there's like a ton of reasons why, but yeah, I think like it just goes to show, I guess, like people who look really successful like still have their own stuff.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences.
Yeah.
Before you go, do you have any advice for people who may be listening?
Well, I mean, I would say, especially for like younger people, like your age, I know you're about to go to college and like that's a whole new time in life.
Yep.
I think like this won't apply to everyone, but like for the people who are very perfectionistic or very ambitious, like, I don't know. I wish that I had been able to, like, people could have told me this and I wouldn't have been able to internalize it, but I wish I could have been able to internalize that, like, everything would still turn out okay if I could just like loosen my grip a little bit on literally everything. Like, I had such a tight grip on being this like perfect student. I didn't even know why. Like, I've always been that way. I always had to have straight A's. I would like be sad if I got a 90 on a test instead of like a 98. And like, I don't know where that came from. My parents didn't care. Like, I mean, they cared, but like they weren't the ones pushing me. My dad literally in high school would be like, because I would be up late studying and like crying because I felt like I had a math test the next day and I was crying because I didn't feel ready. I felt like I was stupid, didn't know how to do stuff. And my dad would literally be like, get a B, like, please get a B. I will be proud of you if you get a B. Just go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I couldn't let myself do it. And I don't know why. So I think like, I don't know, like when you're young, it feels like every decision you make is like going to be what determines the rest of your life. So if you tend to be a perfectionistic, I would really like, especially if you're going into college and you know that you're someone who tends to be perfectionistic, I think my advice would be like, start examining that now. Go to a therapist. Like, I wish that I, like, at the time there was more stigma around therapy. I didn't know anyone who was in therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm like, why isn't everyone in therapy? And I think like, if I were, your age and embarking on this, and I knew I was someone who could be really type A and perfectionistic, like, go to therapy and like have someone help you figure out like, why do you feel like things need to be this certain way? Because for me, it was like, by being so perfectionistic, I totally cut off like possibilities for what my life could be. For example, I've always been like, first in school, a lot of things came like not easily to me. I always felt like I did well because I worked harder than everyone else, which is like a classic imposter syndrome mind. Like, oh, I'm not smarter than people. I just work harder, but whatever. But I always found like math to be difficult and like harder than other things. Mind you, I'm getting A's, but like I felt stupid and I felt like I was like so bad at math because it was actually like pretty challenging for me versus like language and stuff has always been easier for me because it's how my brain works. And I realized like my entire life, because I was so afraid to be bad at something, I like always shied away from things that I like had a possibility of failure at. So like I wouldn't take like more advanced math or science classes. I wouldn't like do a sport if I stopped playing soccer because I thought was gonna get cut. Like, I loved soccer. And like the whole reason I stopped was just because I was afraid I wasn't good enough. And so like I realized that like over my life, I kept making these choices to like get away from failure. And then that totally like cut off all this opportunity and possibility. Like, I could be a mathematician now, or like I could be all these different things had I not like cut myself off from the possibility because I was so afraid of being bad at something. So like I would give people that advice too. Is like, and like I make that mistake continually. I realized that mistake before I went to grad school and I made it again. Like, I was like, oh, I'm not going to do that again. I did that in college and I realized, in high school and elementary school, and I realized what a mistake it was. I repeated the exact same mistake. So I'm like definitely not perfect. But yeah, like just notice yourself if you're doing that. Cause like especially when you're young, like don't cut yourself off from what life could be for you because you're afraid that you're not going to be good at it. Like, I just wish I had been able to internalize from like a very young age that it's okay to not be good at something. Mm-hmm. And I still, and like, I'm 31 and I still don't take that message to heart. Like, I still struggle with it, but I think if you start working on it young, like had I realized it when I was 18 or 19, my life could be completely different. Mm-hmm. So that's very like obviously individualized advice, like coming from literally my experiences, but that is like the biggest thing that I wish I had done differently my whole life.
So do you have any advice for future podcasters or activists?
Yeah. I think for podcasters, I feel like I don't have that much advice because like my little production is very low production value. So I think like maybe think about like what your goals are for your podcast before you get started. Mm-hmm. Because like for me, I never really expected this to, like, it's very, especially now, like post 2015 was like the year to get in. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that like you can't be successful now. I find that a lot of the ones that are successful now like have a lot of like they have a production company behind them, or they have like something behind them to help them. Not to say you shouldn't do it, but I think like just like set goals and be realistic about like what it could be and how much time you're willing to devote to it. Because like if I devoted like my whole life to it, like sure, maybe the podcast could be bigger, maybe I could like be making ad money, but like I didn't, and so it's not. So like just have realistic expectations. And then my advice for activists, again, I still have imposter syndrome. I'm like, am I an activist? Is just to like, I think this is my advice for like any person, but especially if you want to be an activist, is like, don't be afraid to say something. Like, I think a lot of people, and we've probably all learned this in the last year with like George Floyd and all that stuff. I think a lot of people, like their hearts and minds are in the right place, but they're afraid to say something because they're afraid they're going to say it wrong, or they're afraid they're going to like say something and it's going to like isolate people and people will disagree with them. Like I think you need to get over that fear. Like, first of all, it's better to say something and have it be imperfect and like learn from that than to say nothing at all. And then also you just can't worry about who you're going to offend or who, like which racist aunt of yours is going to get mad, because like you got to live your life. So I think just like start speaking up early and often, and like don't wait for the perfect opportunity. You know, you don't have to be marching people through the streets. You can be podcasting, you can be posting to social media, you can be the person who in your class raises your hand and says, hey, like, can we talk about how this applies to, for example, Black people? Like, can we talk about how, you know, we're ignoring poor people when we talk about this topic? Or, hey, thanks for saying that. I just want to point out that like what you said could be problematic because XYZ. Like, speak up. And it's scary, but I think the people whose respect you care about will end up respecting you more.
Cool. Well, thank you again so much for your time and doing this interview with me. It was really nice to meet you. And for all you listening, you can check out Katie's podcast on Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joanna. It's really nice to talk to you. And I feel like I just monologued for everyone, but I guess that's the point. So
yeah, of course. I love hearing your story and just getting to know a little bit more about you. And I'm sure people who have heard your podcast or seen your other videos like would like to get to know you too. So
yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, I don't talk about myself that much, so thank you. Yeah,
of course, no problem.